maritime domain awareness is very important. And if China has an Achilles heel, it is its ability to transit through those narrow straits, whether it's Malacca, Lombok, or Sunda, and come and operate extensively in the Indian Ocean. With good maritime domain awareness and a good undersea warfare capability, we should be effectively able to counter any major Chinese presence in the near future from either entering the Indian Ocean if push comes to shove, or even if they're able to enter the Indian Ocean, we can't stop them from entering if they're entering the Indian Ocean in peacetime. We'll be able to monitor not only their surface platforms, but we'll be able to effectively monitor their submarines. Because submarines, if they have to transit through the Malacca, Lombok, or Sunda Straits, have to transit on surface. Now, this is where these foundational agreements help, because these boats can be tracked all the way from the mainland of China into the Indian Ocean, and thereafter, with information sharing, intelligence sharing, interoperability between platforms, we can definitely be able to counter any Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean. Secondly, maritime domain awareness gives us a lot of reach. When you have an aircraft like the P-8I, which has an endurance of 12 to 16 hours, that gives you a very wide coverage of the Indian Ocean. Now, if you take, let's say, the Andaman Nicobar Islands, that gives you another 700 miles beyond that, because they are 700 miles from the Indian mainland. Now, when you have agreements like Lemoa, Comcasa, or Becca, you can land your aircraft at Diego Garcia, you could land it at Singapore, you can land it at various other places, which increases the reach and the range exponentially. So I think in the larger context, the Quad will be a very important maritime security construct, but that is not all the Quad will be. It is not just about containing China. I think from a maritime perspective also, the Quad has a much larger role to play. It can become the fulcrum for a much larger maritime, like-minded maritime democracies working together. The French have expressed their intent of having a fairly robust naval presence. The Brits are going to be bringing their aircraft carrier into the Pacific next year. Various other navies are going to be operating. So I think the Quad has the potential to be the sort of fulcrum and the foundation around which a much larger Indo-Pacific maritime security construct can be created, not only to contain China, indirectly, yes, but also to build capacity, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, blue economy initiatives, and much more that it can do. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd just like to say to everyone, to the audience, if you have questions, please put them on the chat function. I think we can pick them up from there later on. But as we go along and you think of something, please feel free to drop it off on the chat area. So I turned to Captain Hamlet, who initially, when I read his name, I thought it was Hamlet, and I was going to refer to him as the Prince of Denmark throughout. But as it is, that was just a misreading. So Captain, as the others have mentioned, the Quad, the Indo-Pacific, the only country who is a member of all of this that actually has, should we say, two ocean capacity and the ability to function from Madagascar all the way to Hokkaido, is the United States. So where do you see America being able to, should we say, how strong is America's commitment to this? Will it survive changes of your government? And where do you see the American view on this, of the evolution, if you wish, of the Indo-Pacific?
That's a great question. Thanks for having me, and thanks for that question. I'll just start off before I get to the question. I wanted to thank Rice and House for inviting me to participate in the forum. I'm honored to share the virtual stage here with people who have greater subject matter expertise in the Indo-Pacific than I do. So it's a real learning opportunity for me. Editor Chowdhury, I agree with your opening point a few minutes ago about the importance of the India-US relationship, and the fact that just a week before our presidential election, our defense, Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State being in India, I think is a strong indicator of the importance. And over the past 20 years of my career, I've noticed a significant uptick, a consistent uptick in the importance that U.S. military and national security leaders put on the relationship with India. And, that's something that has spanned multiple different presidential administrations, Republican and Democrat. It has also been, it was noticeable in big meetings that I would be part of in the Pentagon or at the U.S. Pacific Command, or when I worked in Moscow as the naval attaché there. I made very good friends with several of the Indian naval attachés to Russia. And I think, what we've all seen is that there's a real commonality in thinking about global security, and that comes from the United States and India sharing deep democratic values. So it's all very important. And I wanted to say to Ambassador Prakash, I considered using that same Churchill quote when I was thinking last night about how I might, start off with a joke. I've always loved that Churchill quote, and I think it's so true. The United States has made many mistakes in the region, especially in the last 20 years, with regard to our ability, our thinking about our ability to bend Chinese behavior toward the international rules-based order. That started with Kissinger, and it again spanned Republican and Democrats in the White House. There was this thinking that if we could integrate China into the global economy and make them the trading partners that they now are, that would bend their thinking and their behavior, both internally, their human rights behavior, and externally in terms of how they, participate on the global stage. It hasn't worked, and I think now, to the question that both of you asked, if there is a change in administration, next week and in January, will the United States' current views on China remain? And I think that they will. I think both Republican and Democratic leaders, and likely, Secretary of State, likely Secretary of Defense, and significant leaders in a Democratic White House administration would have similar views. I think we've over the past 20 years, China has revealed its spots, right? It has shown what it is really intent on doing in the region. It has shown that it intends to be the regional hegemon, and more Americans, particularly in the national security realm, have come to realize that China's goal for 2049, which is not that far away now, is to be the preeminent power on the global stage. And so that gives everybody pause. It doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat in the United States. There's a sense that China is the pacing threat for the United States and for our allies and partners around the world as well. I wanted to just touch on a couple of things. First off, to Commodore Singh, I wanted to thank you for being a member of the Naval Institute, and I'm proud to point out that one of your colleagues, retired Admiral Sudarshan Shrikande, and I hope I'm saying his name correctly, has written about Indo-Pacific security in Proceedings magazine twice in the past year. I think it was October 2019, and then in August of this year. And in August this year, he wrote an article about the importance of growing the Quad. So several of you mentioned the Quad, and we also see that that's an important way to offset China's, flexing its military muscles. 2008 to 2012, I was in charge of a large team of analysts at the U.S. Pacific Command, now notably the Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii, that focused intently on Chinese military power, its buildup, its modernization, its informationization, tactics, strategy. And we were among the first people in the U.S. government to realize what was happening in China and the alarming trends of its impressive military buildup. Commodore Singh just mentioned that China now has the world's largest Navy, and in terms of hull numbers, over 350 combatants. It's still smaller in gross tonnage than the United States Navy, but quantity has a quality all its own, as the Russians used to like to say, and we quoted many times. And that buildup, what China did with its military buildup is there were a couple of key points in recent history, right, that determined its trajectory. So first was the 1996 Taiwan crisis, where the United States responded with 2 carrier strike groups coming to Taiwan's rescue, or to influence events there. And the Chinese watched that, and they determined that they would never let that happen in the future. And so they embarked on a program to build what we now in the West call anti-access area denial capabilities. And the Chinese term is more directly translates as countering foreign intervention. And so they've built military capabilities to deal with the Taiwan problem, and they've built military capabilities specifically targeted at keeping foreign powers out of that fight. And I think those same capabilities translate into the South China Sea very well as well, right? So the 9-dash line, their maritime blue territory. So they built capabilities for that, for the regional, countries around the South China Sea, but also the capability to keep others out, United States, India, Japan, Australia, etc. And they also looked at 2 events in the early 2000s when the United States became embroiled in 2 very expensive, exhausting land wars in South and Southwest Asia. The Chinese leaders realized that they had a 10-year window of opportunity. It really became probably a 15 or 20-year window of opportunity where the United States was bogged down and its focus would be on the Middle East and on counterterrorism. And by the time the United States realized what China was doing, we had to play catch up, and we had to adjust our focus and our strategy and our capabilities. And, say what you want about the Trump administration. There are, as you can tell in United States politics, there are real differences of opinion. But I think there has been a pretty strong agreement that the national security strategy of 2018 was a very good one. And the national military strategy that resulted from that specifically names China and Russia as the peer competitors that we have got to be able to deal with. And so that I think that's another indication of the enduring focus that will exist for the China problem going forward, whether no matter who is in the White House. Just a couple more things I wanted to point out. Generally, I'm an optimistic person, although 2020 has definitely challenged my optimism. My experience, really significant challenges as China now poses to the Indo-Pacific region. Responding to challenges like that require a couple of different things. One is to see the problem clearly, and I think the United States now does see the problem very clearly. Determining a way to tackle the challenge, and I think we've got a very good, strong national security strategy and national military strategy. I'm not sure that we can afford them. That's another an aside for sure. But also a resolve to expend resources and assembling a great team to act. And so I think assembling a great team, not just internally in the United States, but also putting together a great team of allies and partners. And I think that gets back to the point about, the 2 leaders that are in India now for the 2+2 meetings. And I think it also is true that what China is trying to do is very detrimental to the national and regional security interests of most countries in the Indo-Pacific region. And most nations, especially the democratic nations, realize that now. India, Australia, Japan, United States, New Zealand, most of the ASEAN nations have realized that pushing back against Chinese hegemony and behavior that's not in line with international norms will require teamwork. And China hates it when multiple nations align against it. Whenever possible, they like to divide and conquer. They like to go after a specific country and get them to cow. But if bigger regional states or multi-regional states can be disciplined about working together and share their common values and demonstrate what right looks like, I think that's when you find a place where China has to take notice, has to change its behavior, and at least in the short term, put its immediate goals on hold. So I'll stop there. And if I didn't answer your question directly, let me know and I'll come back to it.
Thank you for anyway three pretty comprehensive opening statements. I remind everybody, if you have a question, I see we've picked up a few already, but please post your questions on the chat, and we will come to that after this next round. Ambassador, one of the things that we've seen in terms of the Indo-Pacific is a question of how do you bring in more people besides the Quad, more countries into effectively an anti-Chinese coalition, or a coalition that is at least concerned about China. And I was noticing that, for example, during the pandemic, we had Steve Biegun, as you mentioned, the US Deputy Secretary of State, at a number of meetings during the beginning of the pandemic, where he pointedly invited the Quad members, plus the New Zealand, South Korea, and Vietnam. And a lot of those discussions began about the pandemic and COVID response, and became eventually about the post-COVID world before they were eventually ended. Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo, then held a conference with his fellow foreign ministers. There he had the Quad, if I remember correctly, Quad, South Korea, Brazil, and Israel. Obviously not the last two are not Indo-Pacific nations per se, but curiously again, the Quad was at the heart of this, the core, if you wish, of that round of discussions. And I believe a lot of that was about technology alliances, if you wish. Then the American system proposed that the G7 summit that was supposed to be held in America this year, and has been postponed, would be the Quad. It would actually be the G7 plus the three members of the Quad plus South Korea. So you had at the heart of all of these formulations, if you wish, was always the Quad. What other countries do you think it makes sense to bring into a larger Indo-Pacific grouping? Does it even make sense to do so? The Quad remains obviously still a road under construction. What other countries should we bring in? And I think if there is going to be a Biden administration, going by the public statements and comments by his key foreign policy advisors, they talk about having, if you wish, coalitions built around technology and economics against China, but argue that the coalitions will each be different from the others. What do you think makes sense to bring into these type of groupings?
Thank you and bless you. That is a very, very pertinent question. And, there have been efforts made to introduce the concept of Quad Plus or Quad Plus Plus, and you have named these countries, and perhaps I don't recall whether you mentioned Indonesia. Even Indonesia was tried out at one point in time. Mm-hmm. Now, the fact remains that the entire world, almost every country in the world is hedging. No country wants to take a stand. No country wants to choose between the US and China, and certainly not the Indo-Pacific region countries, and even Europe. And some have expressed a bit of surprise that Germany has finally taken a bit of a stand, and having earlier hitched its wagon with China. So, and none of these countries that were invited for the Quad Plus can afford or want to offend China. And the one country that I've served in, South Korea, is the most reticent country, because they have tasted the wrath of China when they brought in the THAAD missiles, and China preaches to the world that you should not link economic matters with political or military matters, but they are the first to do that, and afflicted by the big power syndrome of do as I say, not as I do, the way they behaved with Korea. So Korea is that way, will never do anything to offend China, and so would the other countries. Now, in my book, the only country that we should invite, which is ready, is France. France has the heft, the desire, the ability, the stake They have territorial interests in the Indian Ocean region. They are a military power, and there is not much love lost between the French and the Chinese. At this moment, France is the most suitable candidate which should be invited for Quad to join Quad and also play an active role in the Indo-Pacific region. Till the position becomes clearer, other countries are going to hedge because, one challenge that I would like to flag here, and I also have a bit of a query for Bill and Commodore Anil, is that countries are a little unsure of the continuity in US's approach because US is a big power. US is a big power. They have multiple interests, but when you come talk of geostrategy and you talk of taking on or building a coalition to thwart the aggression of China, you're looking long term, and you want consistency, and that is where the US needs to assure the members of the Committee of Nations that they are committed to that. I hope I've managed to at least answer the part of your question. Now, query that I have, Bill, and again, Commodore Anil Jaising can weigh in, and obviously, Chair, your views are very important, is are we as a community of nations underestimating the threat of China? Now, let me just take the case of North Korea. With all its information at its command, intelligence, tech int, etc., US has been consistently underestimating the abilities of North Korea to build weapons of mass destruction. And are we doing the same with China? When you say that USA sees the problem clearly vis-a-vis China, are we quite confident that we see the problem? Because, last comment is that in January 2019, the naval chiefs, our naval chief, Admiral Lamba, had invited some naval chiefs, I think the Quad naval chiefs in particular, and the US naval chief was also there, when there was a discussion precisely about the naval capabilities of China, and it was noted and underlined that in human history, no navy has grown as fast as the Chinese navy in the last 200 years. So that is a kind of single-minded determination that this country has, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you, Chair.
So let me turn to the Commodore. Perhaps you have any responses to the ambassador's statements? And given what you had mentioned and what Captain Hamblin had mentioned, you mentioned that India continues to be relatively slow, if you wish, in its naval buildup. Captain Hamblin asked whether America could actually afford the buildup, even the buildup that it has right now. And I think at the heart of that remains a very key problem that all the countries responding to the Chinese challenge have, is that they have their, should we say, a reluctance to spend as much maybe as required. And individually, definitely, their resources are far too small to take on the Chinese. And how much is that going to be a restriction, if you wish, on the development of a balance to China, even a collective one?
First, I think responding to what Ambassador Vishnu Prakash said. So I agree with you that I think, the first couple of years of the Trump administration led to a certain amount of uncertainty in the minds of even the US allies about where exactly the US stood. If you recollect, he made statements like, you got to pay for your security, etc., etc. So these statements, and this was, it had been preceded by the Indo-Pacific policy of President Obama, which today many term as a major foreign policy failure. That pivot became a rebalance, and they really weren't able to stop the Chinese expansionism. They allowed China to build the artificial islands, etc., etc. So I think there was a certain amount of uncertainty. There perhaps still is. China too, while it's expanding its navy at this astronomical pace, is also probably biding its time. It feels that eventually, perhaps 15, 20 years from now, the US Navy would run out of steam to maintain the same sort of tempo and momentum in the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, I think it will take a lot of reassurance to convince all the Pacific nations, which are much smaller, to be able to commit themselves totally to an anti-China coalition, or let's not call it that, or to the so-called arc of maritime democracies looking for a rules-based international order. So I don't think, I mean, my view is that I don't think ASEAN will always have to live in accommodation with China. They cannot afford to antagonize. None of the ASEAN countries, either individually or collectively, can afford to antagonize China, because they've got to remain in that region for the rest of their existence. As far as whether we are doing enough, whether navies are doing enough or countries are doing enough to understand the Chinese threat, considering the way the Chinese are building their navy. Well, the US, of course, has been talking of a 355 ship navy, but from 270 odd. So building 80, 85 warships, they've also restricted their shipbuilding capacity, is considerably restricted. Their platforms are very expensive. So it will take time, if at all they are able to build up a 355 ship navy, which probably Captain Hamlet will be able to tell us better. But India, I think, from an Indian perspective, we need to do a lot more in the shipbuilding space. Our warship building is not moving apace. Just to give you an example, this year itself in 2020, China has commissioned 4 major destroyers already, including 2 Type 052D destroyers, which are fairly modern and pretty large destroyers. But in addition, they've also commissioned 2 Type 055 destroyers, 055 type, which are the largest destroyers in the world and pack a hell of a mean punch, sir. So I think whereas India hasn't commissioned a destroyer in the last 3.5 years. They're all in build, but we haven't commissioned a single one. So that is a sort of asymmetry that is slowly building up. Like I'd mentioned, China is building 20 to 25 major warships a year. I had done an article in which I had carried out this study between 1998 and 2018. In that 20-year gap, China built 132 ships and 50 submarines. We built 25 ships in the same amount of time, 25 ships and submarines we commissioned. So this asymmetry that's building up, and that is why I had said that while the Chinese Navy is not a match for the Indian Navy in the Indian Ocean today, the situation could well be different 7 to 10 years from now, when they have the bases, they have the ships, they have the capability, and now they're building a blue water navy. They're going in for large ships. They're building Type 075 amphibious landing docks. We've cancelled our landing platform dock program. Our naval budget has come down from 18% to 13% at a time when everyone is talking about the maritime security dimension. We are probably the only country in the region which is actually reducing its naval budget. Pakistan is getting a lot of weaponry from China. So we've really got to, I think, relook our sort of our approach to our own maritime security. And one thing we should be very clear about: we have to look after our own maritime interests. Nobody else is going to do it for us. So I think we need to look at that again. So are we underestimating the Chinese threat? I don't think we're underestimating the Chinese threat. Perhaps we are not giving enough attention to it. Perhaps we got a little carried away by the Wuhan reset and this lot of bonhomie that seemed to exist at the highest levels. Perhaps we got a little carried away by that. We tended to neglect it. But I think in the last 6 months, there has been a shift in India's stance towards China. We are not so reticent about naming China. We are taking a bold stand. And you mentioned the famous Raisina dialogue panel discussion between the 4 chiefs, where Admiral Lamba was very, very cagey about even mentioning China or saying anything that could possibly even imply that China was part of that discussion, which led the CNC PACOM thereafter 2 months later in Singapore at another conference. He made a statement saying that the Quad seems to be a non-starter, and he also alluded to India being the weakest link in that. But I think things have moved on since then. Now we are not so reticent. We've been pretty about it. We're having the 2+2. We've invited Australia for Malabar. So I think there's a little shift in our stance, towards China as well after what's happening on the border in the Himalayas.
Thank you. So, Captain, you've got a lot of questions, particularly about U.S. commitment, and some time. So please go ahead. And after you're done, we will turn to the questions.
Yeah, I'd echo what Commodore Singh said. I think the United States, I would say that we are taking China and its military buildup and its capabilities advancements very seriously within the military, and I think within the national security establishment. If you went back, I remember when I worked in Hawaii at the U.S. Pacific Command, now Indo-Pacific Command. One of the things that confused us, and we were working for Admiral Willard, and Admiral Willard is one of the sharpest admirals I ever worked for, and he spent, I think, 5 of his 7 flag officer or admiral tours in the Pacific. So he had watched the Chinese build up for quite some time and was very concerned about it. And he asked us, as soon as he moved up from being the Pacific Fleet Commander to being the Pacific Command Commander, he said, I want you to do 2 things for me. So for the intel team, it was, what's China's strategy vis-a-vis the United States? And that was fairly easy to put together. There's a lot of study that had already been done, in China, was fairly clear on its strategic objectives. And then he said, but the one that was more difficult for us to do was, his question was, what's the United States' strategy towards China? There wasn't one. There was no written strategy anywhere. And so the J5 team, not the J2 team, but the J5 team went about, having conversations with people in Washington, the Pentagon, State Department, et cetera. And what they realized very quickly was that it was a very bifurcated strategy. There wasn't a formal strategy, but the informal strategy, if you put together what significant key leaders had said over a decade or so, was that part of the U.S. government was all about engaging China. So the Treasury, the State Department, anything having to do with human rights and those sorts of things, global warming, environmental affairs. We were engaging China. It was all about engaging and becoming partners with China and trying to find common ground, et cetera. And then you had the national security part of the United States government that was hedging. So this bifurcated U.S. strategy was engage but hedge. And the 2 parts of that strategy, so the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies largely didn't talk to the Treasury Department, didn't talk to State Department all that much. And so you had these 2 different, camps in the U.S. government kind of pursuing different objectives with China. I think that now particularly under the Trump administration, with the national security strategy that names China, and this gets to I think what Commodore Singh just said, where the seniors in the Indian government are now naming China as the problem, right? And the same thing is happening in the United States. We are naming China. We're talking about it specifically. We are pointing out the malign behavior, and we're saying that this is the pacing threat. This is what we're building U.S. military capabilities to be able to deal with. So now the question of whether we can afford it or not is an interesting one in proceedings over the past month, since Secretary Esper, our Defense Secretary, released the shipbuilding plan, or the future force structure plan for the U.S. Navy, which calls for 500 or so ships, many of them unmanned platforms. There's been a constant dialogue about whether that's even affordable. We can afford what we have now, about 292 or 95 ships, but the shipyard capacity to build them and to maintain them is stretched right now. So if we want to build an even larger Navy, how are we going to expand that shipyard capacity, the industrial capacity behind a Navy, which is a critical Achilles heel, can be. I think all of that points to how important it is that all the nations that we've mentioned in the Quad and the Quad Plus, right? You know, add in South Korea, you add in maybe even some of the Middle Eastern nations, you add France. I thought that was a very interesting point. You know, to become part of that like-minded military maritime coalition, but also to be part of the geopolitical pushback against Chinese behavior.
Thank you. Let me just quickly turn to the questions now. Yashri Bharat has already asked the question that I think we've already answered, which is how what would be the Quad Plus?